Welcome to the deep dive, where we take all those things you're curious about and dive in. This time it's abdominal training. All those sources you sent in, we're going to extract all the good stuff for you. And I got to say, looking at this stack, it's not going to be about doing endless crunches.
No, not at all. You've provided a really interesting collection here. A lot of it centered around Pavel-Tsatsouline's bulletproof abs and some pretty interesting firsthand accounts, testimonials, it seems like.
Yeah.
So our mission, I guess you could say, in this deep dive is to really understand his approach to building not just a six-pack, but really resilient, functional abs, and maybe challenge some of the conventional wisdom along the way.
Well, let's start with a challenge right out of the gate. This one really caught my eye. Dr. James Garrick, he tested the U.S. Junior National Gymnastics team. These are athletes with, I'm quoting here, muscle definition that's strained to belief.
Right.
But get this, many of them couldn't even do 5 crunches. 5. It really makes you wonder if all those crunches we've been doing are actually giving us the core stability and athletic performance we think they are.
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? I mean, you have these incredibly fit young athletes who use their core strength all the time, and they're struggling with a very basic ab exercise. So it does make you question, is there a disconnect between how we traditionally train abs and what actually makes for a strong and functional core?
Yeah, it seems like maybe looking strong and actually being strong, 2 different things.
Exactly.
So, let's unpack that then. Let's start with probably the exercise we all associate most with abs. The crunch. What's the problem with crunches?
Well, to understand that, you kind of have to look at the anatomy a little bit. You've got your rectus abdominis, that's the muscle that gives you the six-pack look, right?
Right.
It runs from your pubic bone up to your breastbone. And when it contracts, its primary action is to cause forward spinal flexion, basically rounding your back like you do in a crunch.
Okay, so far so good.
But then there's another muscle that plays a big role, and that's the psoas major.
Psoas?
Yeah, the psoas. It's a powerful hip flexor. It originates on your lower back vertebrae and attaches down to your thigh bone. So when the psoas contracts, it pulls your thigh towards your chest, like in the upward motion of a full sit-up.
So it's not just your abs working when you do a sit-up.
Right. And in fact, a lot of times, especially if you're not careful, you end up doing a sit-up by basically pulling yourself up by your lower back using those psoas muscles. And that can put a lot of strain on your lumbar spine.
Which is probably why so many people complain about lower back pain when they do sit-ups.
Exactly. Now, with crunches, you're not going through that full range of motion. But the source still points out that even with a crunch, there's something called the law of irradiation that comes into play.
Okay, irradiation, what's that?
Basically, when you create tension in one muscle, it can kind of spread to nearby muscles. So when you're doing a crunch and you're contracting your abs really hard, it can cause your hip flexors to contract as well. Like imagine making a fist, really tight.
Yeah.
You'll probably feel some tension in your forearm, even though you're not actively bending your wrist.
Oh, yeah, I see what you mean. So even when I'm trying to target my abs, these other muscles are jumping in.
Right. And this is a big problem because it means you're not really isolating the abs. And in fact, a chiropractor named Dr. John Scaringe points out that people with weaker abs tend to rely even more on their hip flexors during crunches. So instead of using their abs to round their back and lift their torso, they're yanking on their spine with their hip flexors to get that momentum.
It's like a vicious cycle then. Weak abs lead to more hip flexor use, which just makes things worse.
Exactly. And all those gadgets you see, those ab rockers and things like that, they might change the angle or give you some support, but they can't really solve this fundamental problem.
So if crunches are out, what's the alternative? This is where Professor Janda comes in, right?
Yeah, so the question becomes, how do you work your abs effectively without those hip flexors taking over? And Professor Vladimir Janda, he was a real pioneer in this area, back pain, muscle function. He came up with this really clever approach based on something called the law of reciprocal inhibition.
Okay, lots of laws today. Break this one down for me.
It's actually pretty simple. Basically, when one muscle contracts, the muscle on the opposite side of the joint tends to relax. It's a reflex, helps your body move efficiently. Think of it like you can't press the gas and the brake at the same time in your car, right?
Makes sense. So how does this apply to abs?
So Janda had his patients do a sit-up, or even just a crunch, but while they were pressing against resistance on their calves. This engages the hamstrings and glutes, the muscles on the back of your legs. And because of this reciprocal inhibition, the hip flexors relax.
So you're tricking your body into letting your abs do the work.
Exactly, and this is the key to the Janda sit-up. But there is one problem. It usually required a partner to provide that resistance on the calves.
Uh-huh. And this is where Pavel's solution, the ab Pavelizer, comes in.
Exactly. This thing is described as being super heavy duty, like industrial steel. One testimonial even calls it the Rolls-Royce of ab machines.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does it work?
So you basically wedge it under a door, and then you lie down with your calves on these roller pads, and you do your sit-ups. But because of the way the Pavel-approved is designed, you're constantly pushing against resistance with your hamstrings and glutes. So you get that same hip flexor relaxation as in the Janda Situp, but you can do it all on your own.
And the source recommends starting with negatives, right?
Yeah, that's a good place to start, especially if you're new to this. So you start in the up position and then slowly lower yourself down, taking about 3 to 4 seconds. And the key here is to really squeeze your glutes, keep those muscles engaged the whole time.
So, squeezing your butt during an ab workout. Seems counterintuitive.
But it's essential. That's what's keeping those hip flexors relaxed. And speaking of keeping things relaxed, there's also this breathing technique that's recommended, holding your breath during the lowering phase. But obviously check with your doctor first if you have any concerns about that.
And how do you progress from negatives to full sit-ups?
Gradually. Start with your arms by your sides, then move to a boxer position, fists near your face, then arms overhead. And then finally, when you've mastered those, you can start doing the full sit-up. And once that becomes easy, you can add weight, like a barbell plate or even a soup can.
One of the testimonials mentions even husky bodybuilders struggling with just a few Janda sit-ups.
Yeah.
It really shows you how different this is from traditional ab training.
Right. It's about quality, not quantity. And the testimonials really highlight that. I mean, there's Chris Dudzik. He talks about going from having a weak and painful back to being completely pain-free, and even hitting new personal bests in his deadlifts and squats. And Linda Crawford, she's a powerlifting champion, she credits Pavel's routines for her incredibly strong abs.
So that's isolation. But then the source moves on to integration.
Right.
Right. Why is that important?
Well, because having strong abs in isolation is not enough. You have to teach them to work together with the rest of your body to create real functional strength and stability. This is where part 2 of the source comes in.
Makes sense. I mean, going back to those gymnasts, they obviously had strong abs, but they weren't functioning the way they needed to.
Exactly. And there's this concept of intermuscular coordination that the source talks about. It's basically how well different muscle groups work together to produce force. Like, imagine a football team with really talented players, but they can't coordinate their plays.
They're not going to win many games.
Right. So this Bulletproof Abs program is about first isolating the abs with those Janda sit-ups, and then integrating them, teaching them to work as part of a team.
So what's the primary role of the abs in this integrated approach? It's not just about crunching, right?
Right. Unless you're chopping wood all day, the main job of your abs is not to bend you forward. It's to provide stability, a solid platform for your other muscles to work from. And to balance out the pull of that psoas muscle we were talking about earlier.
So it's like a foundation.
Exactly. And if your abs are weak and your hip flexors are strong, you can end up with all sorts of problems, like lower back pain. The source uses this analogy of a pole that's being supported by guy wires. If those guy wires are pulling unevenly, the pole is going to bend.
Okay, I'm getting the picture.
Yeah.
So how do we train this integration?
Well, there are a bunch of exercises that the source recommends. There's the Russian ballet leg thrust, for example.
Okay, I've heard of that one. What is it exactly?
You lie on your back with one leg straight out, the other leg bent, and you slowly lower the straight leg towards the floor while squeezing your glutes. The key is to keep your lower back flat the whole time.
It sounds simple, but I bet it's harder than it looks.
It definitely is. And then there are sit-ups, but the right way. Making sure you're not just pulling yourself up with your hip flexors. The source actually has a test you can do to see if you're ready for full sit-ups. Lie on your back with your legs straight and see if you can flatten your whole back against the floor.
Interesting. I'm going to have to try that. What else is there?
There are scissor sit-ups, which come from martial arts training, and Swiss ball crunches, which are great for working your obliques, those muscles on the sides of your abs.
And what about the evil wheel?
Ah, yes, the wheel jackknife push-up. That one's definitely a challenge. You basically roll out from a kneeling position using an ab wheel, requires a ton of core strength. And then there's Yananis, that killer Spetsnaz special. That's a jackknife push-up variation, super tough. And of course, if you really want to test yourself, there's always Bruce Lee's dragon flag.
Wow, those are some serious ab exercises. But let's move on to the obliques. Why are they so important?
Well, the obliques are what give you that nice, trim waistline, but they're also crucial for athletic performance. Any movement that involves twisting or bending, your obliques are involved. Part 3 of the source really dives into this.
And there's a warning about training them safely, right?
Yeah, the source really cautions against exercises that involve bending and twisting at the same time, especially under load. It can really mess up your back. The author even talks about how he injured himself doing that.
Ouch. So what are some safe and effective oblique exercises?
One of the best is the full contact twist. It's a weird one, but it was actually used by Soviet shot put athletes. You basically load weight onto one end of a barbell and twist from side to side.
Oh.
And is great for developing punching power, too.
Interesting. So it's not just about looks.
Right. And then there's the Saxon side bend, good for building strong obliques, and the suitcase-style one-arm deadlift, which is great for overall core strength and stability.
Okay, so we've covered isolation and integration. What about breathing? Part 4 of the source is all about power breathing.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting. The source talks about how the way you breathe can actually make you stronger. It's all about creating internal pressure, which helps to stabilize your core.
So it's not just about getting oxygen in.
Right. There are all these techniques like groaning, screaming, even holding your breath during a lift. Although, again, you always want to check with your doctor before doing anything too crazy with your breathing.
So what are some specific examples of these breathing techniques?
Well, there's bending the fire, which involves flexing your abs and contracting your, well, let's just say your pelvic floor muscles, while you exhale forcefully.
Okay, moving on. What about the second focus?
That one's all about finishing your exhale with a sharp, explosive grunt. It's used in martial arts to generate power. And then you can combine that with the ab-pavilizer negatives for a real gut buster.
Sounds intense.
Oh, it is. And then there's the vacuum, which is a yogic breathing technique that's great for tightening your deep abdominal muscles. You basically exhale all the air out of your lungs and then pull your stomach in as far as you can.
I've heard of that one. Okay, so the source wraps up with a bunch of questions and answers about ab training. Let's tackle a few of those. What about the idea that high reps are the best way to tone your abs?
That's a myth. Tone, in this context, is about how much tension there is in a relaxed muscle. And you build that tension by training with heavier weights, lower reps.
So not those endless crunches with no weight.
Right. This program is about strength, not just fatigue.
And what about negatives?
Negatives are great because they actually allow you to create more tension in your muscles than when you're lifting the weight. It's all about the force velocity curve, which basically says that slower contractions equal more force.
And isometrics.
Isometrics are good too. The source recommends incorporating pauses during your exercises to increase tension. And there's also this Soviet static dynamic method, which involves holding certain positions for a few seconds.
Should we be doing everything super slow?
Not necessarily. While super slow training can be effective, research suggests that varying your tempo is actually better for overall strength development.
Is one set enough?
Probably not. If you're serious about building strength, you need multiple sets.
Can I still get a six-pack with this program?
Absolutely. While the focus is on strength, you can definitely build muscle too. The source recommends adding in some higher rep sets or just doing more sets overall if you want to see more definition.
How often should we train abs?
You can actually train abs more often than you might think. Daily training is even possible as long as you don't push yourself to failure every time. The key is to listen to your body and adjust your training volume accordingly.
What about people who don't have a gym?
You can still do a lot of these exercises at home. Body weight exercises can be done anywhere. And for the weighted exercises, you can invest in a basic weight set, which is relatively inexpensive.
Any thoughts on using a Nautilus machine for twists?
The source specifically recommends against that. For oblique training, you actually want that irradiation, that spreading of tension to other muscles. And the full contact twist is just a more functional exercise overall.
Do we need separate exercises for abs and obliques?
Not necessarily. They work together in a lot of movements, but you can add in specific exercises if you feel like you need to target one area more than the other.
What about doing abs before lifting weights?
Definitely don't do that. You need your abs to be fresh and strong to protect your spine when you're lifting heavy weights.
What about upper and lower abs?
There's no such thing. You can't isolate different parts of a single muscle. It's all one muscle, the rectus abdominis.
Why relax between reps?
It helps you maintain tension, and it gives your blood pressure a chance to normalize.
What about that idea that abs only work within a limited range of motion?
While the most visible movement might happen in that initial range, Your abs are still working to stabilize your spine at higher angles. And let's be honest, that little rest at the top of a sit-up is kind of nice.
Do I need low body fat to see my abs?
Yes, you need low body fat to see your abs, but you also need to actually develop the muscles. It's not just about being skinny.
What about diet?
The source keeps it pretty simple. Cut back on starches and sugars and eat more protein.
How long until I see results?
You could start seeing noticeable results within a couple of months if you're consistent.
And what about the ab Pavelizer itself? What makes it so special?
It's designed for safety, comfort, and effectiveness. It protects your neck, it helps prevent back pain, and it really isolates those abs. Plus, it comes with those bungee cords for beginners, and it fits under a door so you can use it at home.
All right, so to sum it all up, it's about understanding how your abs actually work, moving beyond just endless crunches, using the right exercises and techniques, and integrating that strength into your overall fitness.
Exactly. It's about building a bulletproof core, not just a six-pack.
So listener, think about how this new knowledge might change your approach to ab training. You might even find yourself questioning some of those long-held beliefs. Maybe you've just unpacked a whole new way of thinking about your core.
Maybe so.
Until next time.
See ya.